Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Sound 14 podcast. And welcome, Chris. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. You recently got a new book out, Bound by War. I love the title, by the way, because it really encapsulates the idea of the book, the U.S. and the Philippines. First off, can you introduce yourself as an introduction?
Sure thing. Yeah. No, my name is Chris Capozzola. I teach American history at MIT, where I've been teaching for a while. And like you said, I just published this book, Bound by War, How the United States and the Philippines Built America's First Pacific Century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you explain more about the book, like how the Philippines and the U.S. started, the history behind that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I got started on this book thinking it would be a small book, and it turned out to be a really big one because the United States and the Philippines have been connected for over a century. And that's what I wanted to show, and to show it for people who know it well, right, including hundreds of thousands of Filipino Americans, but also for people who just don't know this history or never learned it in school.
Mm-hmm.
So the book is partly about the relationship between these two countries in terms of war, right, and the way that fighting wars either against each other or with each other has really structured their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And it also has a big impact on military service. Right? That Filipinos have been serving in the U.S. Armed Forces for decades, right?
Yeah.
And that history is something I really wanted to tell.
Sure. Yeah. The history of the U.S. and Philippines is often overlooked. Like I was in AP U.S. history in high school, and we really didn't discuss it that much in that class. And now you've written a book about it, and I hope people will learn more about the history. And why do you think that part of history is overlooked so much?
Well, I think, there's a couple ways to answer that question, right? Like in one hand, it's overlooked. And I think that's the fault of teachers and officials and other people who don't treat it as important. On the one hand, it's also forgotten. That's by ordinary Americans who just don't want to pay attention to it, don't want to explore this chapter of our history, which does not always show America in a good light. But I also think it's also hidden in plain sight, is the way I describe it, right? That in fact, actually, a lot of people do know that these two countries are connected. They have close family relationships. They've got political connections. And I think I want to just kind of weave that back into American history.
Yeah, because you tell in the book how it's mostly a one-sided relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines, with the U.S. having the power during most of it, and it's left some of the people, like Philippine people, at having a bad reputation with the U.S., right?
So certainly the United States exercised more power in that relationship. It was it's not a even partnership, right? For sure. I try to document different ways in which that plays out, both in the Philippines, but also in the United States, right, as Filipinos migrated to America.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also ways in which Filipinos challenge that discrimination, right, and sort of fought for equality, kind of demanded their rights, and kind of putting that part of the story in there too.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you, why was there U.S. presence in the first place in the Philippines?
Yeah, it's a complicated part of the story, and I think that's part of why it's so complicated that sometimes that's why people don't actually learn too much about it. But the United States did not set out to acquire the Philippines as a colony, right? That we were involved in a war with Spain, and that war was mostly fought in the Caribbean, mostly about Cuba. right? But Spain had colonies all around the world, including in the Pacific, in the Philippines and Guam.
So this was around the 1800s, right?
Yeah, in 1898,
1898.
this war begins. And the war with Spain is really short, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's over in 4 months, and it's a clear victory for the United States. But the problem is that once they've done that, they have intervened in, almost without necessarily intending to, intervened in the effort of Filipinos to win their independence from Spain. So a lot of Filipinos thought in 1898 that their country was going to become independent.
Yeah.
Right? And they even turned to the United States and said, look, you declared independence from Britain in 1776. We're going to do the same thing now. And then the United States chose, and I think this was a fateful moment, right? They chose not to recognize Philippine independence, but in fact to colonize the country. And it was a colony for 48 years.
Yeah. And they used it as a military base, right? In some aspects.
Yeah. So very, very quickly, the United States understands by about 1905 that this is going to be an important an important military facility for facing Japan. Right? In 1905, Japan wins this huge war against Russia and becomes this sort of global power. And at that moment, America understands that this military connection is going to be important.
Yeah.
And I wanted to look at that in the book. I thought, well, I'll write about it up through World War II, up through 1946, when the war's over, and the country becomes independent. But in fact, actually, that military connection remains. Right? There are military bases there all the way until the 1990s, and troops there still today.
Yeah, and in your press release, I read that William Howard Taft, John J. Pershing, Dwight Eisenhower, they all trained there. What was the purpose behind that?
Well, William Howard Taft started out there as a kind of colonial official, right? And thought that if he did a really good job running the Philippines, that it would help him become president, which in fact he did, right?
Yeah.
And other figures who had military experience there, that was in part because the Philippines was one of the biggest places, most important places for the U.S. military during peacetime. Right, so John J. Pershing served in the Philippines, where in fact actually he was involved in a lot of campaigns against Philippine insurgents and some of the Muslim soldiers in the southern Philippines. And Dwight D. Eisenhower played a key role in organizing what would eventually become the Philippine Army. So one after another, generation after generation, American soldiers and sailors have actually spent a lot of time in the Philippines.
Yeah. And we talked over email for a while, and you explained that the 714 actually has a significant part in the book. Can you explain that?
Yeah, no, I was excited to kind of bring the global story of the U.S. and the Philippines and kind of connect it to the Southern California story.
Yeah.
Right. And for me, I think that entry point is actually in Long Beach, where there's U.S. naval facilities, and particularly in the early 20th century, really big one in San Pedro, where Filipino Navy sailors were often stationed. Right. And it's important to remember that for a lot of the 20th century, Asian immigrants were barred from entering the United States, except if they were Filipinos, or if, in particular, if they were Filipinos in the U.S. Armed Forces. So that's one thing that's happening, right?
So
that makes it possible.
Why were so many immigrants barred from coming in?
Well, there were sort of decades of anti-Asian sort of prejudice, starting even as early as the gold rush days in California, right? Competition for land and labor. And this led to, local laws, but even federal laws, right? Starting with the Chinese Immigration Act of 1882 and then just expanding from there. But Filipinos were an exception to this, right? And naval service was a way that Filipinos could migrate to the U.S. And what's really interesting to me is that this small community that starts in Long Beach in the 1920s, it's become sort of the core for bigger and bigger migrations as the generations move on.
Yeah, so they were basically one of the first Asian Americans to come to the U.S., and it paved the way for many generations of that as well.
Absolutely. And there's sort of good kind of accounts of what it was like to live, sort of in Filipino communities in Long Beach or nearby in the 1920s. Close enough to Los Angeles to kind of make connections, to kind of leave the Navy, find new jobs. And then over time, by the 50s and 60s, when, this becomes a more kind of suburban area, there are people who move into kind of some of the new suburbs in the area and settle down.
Mm-hmm. And so currently, is there still a good connection between the U.S. and the Philippines with both the presidents?
Well, if you look at the reality, yes. If you just listen to the rhetoric, not so much, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there, the headlines have been captured in the last couple of years by some tensions between the United States and with President Donald Trump and the Philippines with President Rodrigo Duterte.
Mm-hmm.
And Duterte has been critical of the United States, has advocated closer ties, not to the U.S., but to China, and wants to suspend or even break a military agreement that we have called the EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
That those headlines, the talk captures the headlines, but the relationship is still really still sound, right, and really quite close.
Okay, that's good to hear. And you talk about how the Pacific century, that the first Pacific century was back in the 1900s, and with China now having an even worse reputation with the Americans, what does the second Pacific century look like?
Well, you're asking a historian to predict the future, which which is hard. But I do think we can say with some confidence, right, that the U.S. and the Philippines will remain connected in the future, partly because of these military reasons I just explained, but also all the other reasons, right, that the connections of Americans and Filipinos as people are in some ways more important than the connections of the United States and the Philippines as governments or armies. So I think those connections are not going away,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly. China will be the challenge for sure, along with other issues, including climate change and other kind of social and public health issues that are going to keep emerging. But the U.S. will continue to engage in Asia from the Philippines. Right? Mm-hmm. It's sort of, it's kind of a home base kind of a perspective that they're bringing.
Yeah, because the U.S. has always had a lot of trade in that area with the Asian countries in general. And so that continues to happen today.
Yeah, I mean, the trade connections are important, but also so are migration connections, right?
Mm-hmm.
Including what are called remittances, right? Sending money home, right? Things like that really kind of tie migrants between the two countries together.
Yeah. And I want to talk about your previous book, Uncle Sam Wants You, World War I and the Making of an American Citizen. Mm-hmm. What were some of the changes that occurred during that time to the American people?
Yeah, so the first book that I did was actually, this one that I did is about a whole century. The first book was about, 19 months of American history. The First World War, this kind of crucial moment. And in that book, I'm not looking at like what's happening on the battlefield. There are plenty of good books about that already. Mm-hmm. I was really interested in how this really brief moment of history transformed American politics and political culture. In particular, and this was for many Americans the moment when they first encountered and engaged the federal government and in its full power. Right?
Yeah.
You have a war going on. The government is making all these demands on people. And they're experiencing sort of political life in whole new ways.
Yeah. And at the time, the U.S. wasn't really involved in other countries' politics, and were mostly just trying to deal with their own problems, their own issues? What?
I don't think that's so true, right? So we're not involved in European politics, right?
Yeah.
But if you ask someone from Latin America, they would say actually America is very involved in this time period, right? So
Yeah.
clearly in the Western Hemisphere, but you're right. This was the first time that the U.S. sends troops to Europe, and certainly the first time that we send large numbers of soldiers anywhere in the world.
Okay. So, so what was the previous interactions, like you said, in Latin America? What were some of those interactions that occurred?
Well, right around the same time period, right? The United States, right at the turn of the 20th century, the United States becomes involved in sort of small scale, and sometimes not that small, occupations of different countries, right? This is the intervention that gives us access to Panama, right, and to the construction of the Panama Canal. The United States occupies the Dominican Republic and Haiti for years, right? Restructures their government, restructures their economy. And of course, the U.S. Is deeply involved in Cuba. It's never formally a territory of the United States, but we are, sort of intervening in their public life for decades.
And what made the U.S. Declare war to get into World War One? I hear that it was the sinking of the I forget the name of the ship.
The Lusitania.
Yeah, the Lusitania.
Yeah. I mean, so the war begins in Europe in 1914, and the United States is very careful not to get involved officially. But the U.S. is indirectly supporting one side more than another, right? We're lending more money to Britain and France. We're selling ammunition to Britain and France. And in 1915, Germany sinks this ship, the Lusitania. Yeah. But it's important to remember, we don't immediately go into the war, right? It takes another 2 years almost before the U.S. enters the war. By which point, the attacks on the United States were becoming more frequent. And that's what draws the U.S. into the conflict.
Okay. And I also want to talk to you about World War II, which was also probably one of the most famous wars in history. And that war, it's recorded in a lot of documentaries, and it's probably the first time that videographers documented a war and such type. What kind of impact did that make by having footage of actual wars?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't actually have as much sort of documentary footage of combat itself in the Second World War, right? We have certainly a lot of sort of video and film coverage, right? But it was just too dangerous, right, for a lot of cameramen to be sort of, filming combat as it was happening, right?
Yeah.
I don't think it necessarily changed how people fought. It certainly changed how people on the home front understood the war, right?
Yeah.
That you'd had a revolution by this point in terms of media, right? People went to the movies in the 1940s the way that, we would watch television now. You just kind of, it was 5 cents. You just turned it on, show up at a movie theater and, watch whatever. And so they were used to seeing the news through film. They were used to that. At that point, the film companies and the government still censored or restricted images that were really violent, gruesome, that showed American soldiers in difficult positions, or even dead American soldiers. Would have not been things that Americans saw. That was much later phenomenon.
Yeah. And speaking of like World War II, the end of World War One was declared with the Treaty of Versailles, right? Correct? Yeah. And that limited Germany's power significantly. But what led to the rise of Germany after that?
Well, man, that's a big question, right? I think it's certainly the case, right, that the Treaty of Versailles was was harsh on Germany, right? It restricted it basically kept them from having any military forces at all. It restricted their economic position. It demanded financial reparations from them that kind of really harmed their economy. So a lot of times people will say that in some ways the First World War caused the second, right? Or that it was one big long war.
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't know if I believe that, right? Because for two reasons. One, the Second World War started in Asia, not in Europe, right? It starts between China and Japan in 1937, right? And so I think that leaves that part out. And then also, I think people had a chance in the 1930s to stop World War II, to stop Hitler, and they didn't. And I think saying, it was destined to happen because of choices made in the 1910s, I think lets those people off the hook a little bit too much.
What was the UN created before the Second World War, or
no? So the Treaty of Versailles creates the League of Nations, which is kind of like the first attempt at that, right? Mm-hmm. The United States never joins it, and it doesn't have nearly the power that the United Nations does. The UN is created in 1945 and the U.S. is really in the lead in forming it, and in part trying to ensure that whatever comes out of World War II is going to be more effective than the League of Nations that had come out of World War One.
Mm-hmm. Because at the beginning of World War II, before that, Germany increases power and they start taking over, expanding to different countries, and the Allies really didn't interfere with that in the beginning. Why is that?
Germany in part just starts breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, right? It occupies territory that it had been excluded from. It
builds a military.
Builds a military, all these things. And each one was a step that most of the other European powers, and including the United States too, felt that it was not enough to risk a war. Right? And in part, that is a calculated step-by-step project of the Nazis. In part, it's also the domestic pressures that each of those countries are facing at home in terms of, they have domestic populations that don't want to go to war again. They've just lived through a war, right, with Germany. And so, they're, in hindsight, we call it appeasement, right? And we say they should have, they should have stopped Hitler sooner. There were political constraints, military constraints that kept them at each moment from doing that.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. I didn't really understand it at first.
Yeah, no, I think it's worth remembering, right, that most Americans and also most British, most French people, if you asked them in the 1930s, they would have said World War I was a terrible mistake. We never should have done it. And so if all your voters think that, it's going to be hard to convince them to challenge Germany again, right? To challenge, when they make a small step here and a small step there. And the Nazis understood that and pushed whenever they could.
Yeah, and when World War II began, the U.S. was hesitant in really joining the war because of what happened in World War II or World War One. But Pearl Harbor occurred, and that really brought them into the war. Correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And so, really from September 1939, and when Germany invades Poland, until December 7th, 1941, the United States is not officially at war, although it's also not neutral, right? The U.S., it's not like World War One. The U.S. is really actively trying to support Britain and France, and particularly Britain after, once the Blitz comes and they're really fighting alone. And Britain is bankrupt. Britain needs weapons. The U.S. is really kind of propping them up.
Yeah.
but it is only the attack of Pearl Harbor that brings the U.S. officially into war on both fronts.
Mm-hmm. And World War II is fought differently than previous wars because of the introduction of a lot of new technology like tanks and airplanes. What led to that kind of advancement in the war, like during that time?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, a lot of those military technologies had been there during the First World War, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tanks and planes, for example. But the scale of them, their abilities, and just even the sheer number of them increases by World War II, right? And on the aerial front, for example, the breakdown of norms that would have made sort of bombing civilians, unjust, right, or immoral, and that breaks down on both sides, right? And so you start to see the large scale bombing of civilian populations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is in part what then makes it possible for the use of atomic weapons at the end of the war.
Yeah.
Right? But a lot of these technologies are created because the warring powers pour enormous amounts of money and time and expertise into them. Right? They don't just come out of nowhere. For
mm-hmm.
sure.
A lot of research, and you explained or you talked about the atomic wars or atomic bombs at the end of the war. Mm-hmm. At the time, I think that the U.S. was pretty much winning the war. And why did they choose to drop the bomb on Japan, even though it was kind of their advantage? But
yeah, it's I always say that it's not that that's a question that's our question from looking back in hindsight about why they chose to drop the bomb. In some ways, there never was a choice about it. Right, the bomb was built to be dropped.
Yeah,
right? They built it because they made it. Right, to not to turn it into a joke, right? But you don't bake a cake and not eat it. Right.
Yeah.
This was the logics of development, the logic of first use. All of that was kind of built into the process from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Were there moments where where that choice could have been inserted, where people could have realized they were making a choice? Mm-hmm. Probably, right? There were a few dissenting voices, particularly by atomic scientists at the very last minute, after they tested it in New Mexico, before they used it in Japan. There was some hesitation once the scientists in particular understood how dangerous it was. Mm-hmm. But that was only even some of the scientists, right? And certainly not many in the military leadership who hesitated over its use.
Mm-hmm. And they dropped 2 bombs, in fact, right? And was that around the same time or same day, or was it separated?
The first was dropped in Hiroshima on August 6th, and the second in Nagasaki on August 9th.
Okay.
In between, there's not a lot of, an awful lot of things happen, but one thing that doesn't happen is Japan doesn't immediately surrender. Mm-hmm. That they do that basically right after the dropping of the second atomic bomb.
Okay. So that declares the end of World War II right there.
Yeah, that Japan surrenders in August, and officially, the war comes to an end in September.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the last question I want to ask you is, why is history so important to learn, especially now? Just not even just American history, but world history. Why is it so important to learn?
I think so. There's this famous line that people repeat all the time, where they say, those who do not understand history are doomed to repeat it. Mm-hmm. But I actually think that's only half right? Because the other part of that is those who do not study history don't get the chance to repeat it, right?
Yes.
But there are all kinds of good things and important things that happened in the past that we should learn about. Learn lessons of people who, the people who did accomplish things, right? That we might also want to accomplish in our own lives, right? And we can look to the past, kind of see how they did it, right? And we face enormous challenges in the future. right? Social, economic, environmental, etc. And I think that to solve those problems, we need tools in the toolkit, not just from 2020, but from our whole human history.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I love history so much personally, because you get to learn how humans lived before, and with written text or with video, you get to see how they lived, how they interacted, what their failures were, what their successes were, and you could find a lot of similarities and differences and everything, really. And sometimes it does repeat itself. You know, history does repeat itself sometimes, and it's fun to learn, you know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I always also say, why restrict your group of friends to those who just happen to be living on the planet at the same time that you are, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Chris, for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Hope you guys enjoyed the podcast, and we'll talk to you guys later. Okay. Bye, Chris.
Bye.
Also, make sure to check out Chris's new book, Bound by War. I've left a link in the description on Amazon so you guys can get it. And it's a great book. We talked about it a little bit on the podcast, but in the book, you'll really go in depth with the U.S. and the Philippines. So make sure to check out the book. And thank you guys for listening. Peace.